I think the European narrative has to fundamentally transform. This kind of intellectual hegemony of the West can no longer continue forever. And the new narrative has to be more open, it has to be more inclusive, it has to be more accommodative. The new narrative has to take on the concerns of the emerging powers in a changing world. For instance, I take the example of climate change. Climate change in India is to a very large extent because poverty is the greatest polluter. A country like India, in which about 350 million people don't have access to electricity, India simply cannot accept the high cost of accepting new norms. And India, therefore, has been arguing for a long time that it is a question of differential responsibilities, that one cannot put fences in space, regulating the scope for an emerging country like India to constantly grow, because high growth rates are the only way in which India can take millions out of poverty. At the same time, this does not mean that India is not sensitized to the environmental difficulties and challenges it confronts domestically. What its problem is with a kind of mandatory requirements that India has to conform to. We talk in India about survival emissions. In the case of Europe, these are lifestyle emissions. Some of these narratives are not going to change. But to give you another concrete example of why differences have arisen, for instance, you have a number of skilled Indian technicians who are working in Scandinavia. And there is a question of allowing the family to come in, the spouse and the children. You would find that Scandinavians would have an approach that this is a visa issue. We would treat this as a human rights problem. Or, for instance, there have been recent reports about the norms which, like Norwegian families follow about how children are to be treated. Our values are different. How can you expect India, which represents 1/6 of humanity, not to safeguard the interests of its millions of people who seek to have a better living? So there is clearly a conflict of interest. But there is scope for mutual understanding, because where there is not going to be agreement, you're not going to have those new rules. It has to be through dialogue, by taking on the concerns of each other, that you can build these new rules of the game. And it's not going to be like the past, where the West could literally have its way and steamroll its way in having the kinds of rules it wants. It's more contentious today. It has to be more dialogue. It has to be more conciliatory. I think one of the biggest challenges which India and Europe confront is that there is a huge information deficit. Despite having one of the longest associations with Europe, we still don't know enough about each other. In fact, there is a permanent lack of mutual knowledge between India and Europe. Culturally, India is open, but I think what you find is that there has been relatively more influence of American culture. Globalization has meant Americanization, because whether it is Hollywood, it is the CNNization of the globe, the relative influence of American culture. There is also a societal preference that is societal as well as the media preference towards the United States. And from India to the United States. And a major reason for this is because we have a very large diaspora, over 3 million people in the United States, which is articulate, high income category, and so on, which is not the case with Europe, because the only diaspora, the large one that we have, is with the United Kingdom. Whereas the rest of the continent, has by and large very thin association. Second problem is that, it's basically been the Anglo-Saxon media which has sort of conditioned Indian perceptions. It's either been, let's say, news feeds from major agencies, Indian correspondents based in London, and that's not a very healthy perspective of trying to look at the complexities and the nuances of continental Europe. What needs to be done is number one, that the Indian press and media should think in terms of stationing more correspondents in Brussels. But since maintaining a correspondent is very expensive, and the Indian media, most newspapers would just have one page on international news. And it's Asia, Africa, China, South Asia, the neighborhood, the United States. So Europe is very often the lowest or the last priority, unfortunately. I think if we take the societal and cultural level first, India and Europe have to engage more meaningfully. There has to be an intensification of civil society dialogue. There has to be more elite interaction, because basically we do not understand or know adequately enough our mutual perceptions. But basically the underlying elements of this dialogue, not a one-way street but a two-way street, where it's real dialogue, where we try to listen to one another, where there is mutual learning, those have to be the new norms of this cultural narrative between Europe and the emerging powers. I'm Rajendra Jain. I am a chairperson and John Monnet Chair at the Center for European Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. I've been a student of contemporary Europe for some time now, and I've been trying to understand Europe for about 2.5 decades. But I still find I have more to learn about Europe than what I understand today.